Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. It's a quick fix for a long and increasingly intoxicating addiction. The United States may have avoided a default, but it keeps dragging the world into an ever deeper debt hole. Is it still possible to break this vicious cycle? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by an American investment broker and financial commentator, Peter Schiff. Mr. Schiff, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you being here. Now, when I think about the kind of economic relationship that the United States has with the rest of the world, it reminds me of a family with an addict, somebody who used to be a pretty good, reliable guy, but slowly but surely developed this addiction to foreign debt, and this habit is definitely getting out of hand. His behavior is getting more and more unpredictable, and the rest of the family doesn't really know what to do with that because they can't live like that any longer, but they can't leave him alone as well. So do you think this is an accurate metaphor?
Yeah, I mean, it's very close. I mean, it's almost like we're the in-law who's overstayed his welcome. You know, maybe he was a welcome house guest at one point, but he stays around for a long time and he eats all your food and he hogs the remote control, you know, and he doesn't clean up after himself. I mean, yeah, I mean, we have really almost a parasitic relationship, I think, at this point with the rest of the world. With the world being the host and unfortunately America being the parasite, because you know, we don't have a balanced trading relationship. America imports all sorts of goods, valuable consumer goods and resources, and we export debt, we export paper, inflation. We trade the world their valuable goods for the money that the Fed prints. And the only way that we can continue to sustain this artificial lifestyle is as long as the world is willing to support it. The world has to be willing to loan us money, but never expect to get paid back. In fact, we just said with this whole debt ceiling charade that if we can't borrow more money, we're going to default. If the world ever wants their money back, we will default.
Staying with this theme of addiction, if I may, the United States, as you just pointed out, got its quick fix. The debt ceiling was raised by yet another $1 trillion. And I think it's obvious that the United States will continue binging and borrowing at least till early February. Why do you think the rest of the world keeps indulging this clearly unhealthy economic behavior?
Well, we're not going to stop in February either. Look, America is going to borrow as much money as the world is dumb enough to lend us. That's the bottom line, because we've already borrowed more money than we can possibly repay. We can barely pay the interest. The only reason we can pay the interest is because the rates are so low. But when rates go up, we won't even be able to afford the interest, let alone the principal. So it's a Ponzi scheme. We've told the world it's a Ponzi scheme, yet for some reason, everybody continues to participate in the scam. The question is, how much longer will the rest of the world throw good money after bad because they don't want to admit the mistakes that they've made, that they've loaned us all this money that they're not going to get back?
And I think one of the reasons why the world doesn't really want to recognize the mistakes that it's made is because American politicians, like most addicts, keep promising that they're going to change. You know, just give us the money today for this last dose, and tomorrow we will check into rehab. And in a similar fashion, American politicians keep saying that, you know, we are going to rein in the expenditures, we are going to increase the revenues, but the debt to GDP ratio keeps increasing. So who do you think should take the initiative here? Is it the addict who has to act first, or those who deliberately or not fit into this addiction?
No, I believe that it's going to have to come from abroad. It's going to have to be the pressure brought about by our creditors. U.S. politicians will never do the right thing until they're forced to. Why should they ever cut government spending if the world is willing to continue to buy our bonds? As long as the world is lending, we're going to keep borrowing. So it's not the debt ceiling. We'll always raise that. It's the lending ceiling. The eventual collapse is going to be imposed upon us from abroad when the world doesn't want to buy our bonds anymore. Then the dollar is going to crash. We're going to have a dollar crisis. We're going to have a sovereign debt crisis, and the party will come to an end. But not on our terms. It'll be the world that finally imposes the discipline that our own leaders lack the integrity or the courage to adopt themselves.
But at the same time, if you look at the behavior of the major American lenders, China, Russia, other big holders of the American currency, I think they've already attempted to win themselves off the dollar, but at the same time, they are doing that in a very, very slow fashion. Do you think that's the right strategy, or are they just prolonging the pain?
Yeah, I think they're prolonging the pain. I think they're going to ultimately have to speed up the pace at which they try to get rid of their dollars. I mean, maybe they're hoping that they can get rid of them slowly enough to salvage the value. I don't think that's going to happen because they actually end up having to buy more. I think that they should try to spend them as quickly as they can before it's too late. And also, since a lot of our creditors are also countries that have major trade surpluses with us, they don't want to acknowledge that they've been wasting their resources selling to a customer who can't pay. China, for example, they want to buy our bonds to support our dollar so that American consumers can buy their products, but we're not actually buying anything because we're getting those products for free because we can't really pay for them, because we can't make exports that the Chinese want. And at some point, I think countries are going to see the wisdom of allowing the dollar to collapse, allowing their own currencies to rise, allowing their own citizens to enjoy all those products that were previously given to Americans.
I heard you say previously that the United States isn't capable of repaying its debt to China, which currently stands at, if I'm not mistaken, at $1.3 trillion. It couldn't repay these debt without significantly diluting the value of the dollar through inflation or possibly even hyperinflation. And that may seem like a workable solution, a win-win, or rather a lose-lose for all. But I think in this case, the American government will be faced with a choice. Who should bear the strongest pain in the long term, whether it is the American lenders through facing a default, or the American people through facing an inflation? And I wonder, if you were calling the shots, who would you prefer, the American people or the American debtors?
Well, some of the American people own U.S. treasuries, so it's not like all of our debt is owned by the Chinese. There are some Americans that own those bonds, but whether it's inflation or default, the American people are going to suffer in the short run. I think they'll suffer more through inflation than through default. I mean, ideally, we would not obliterate our debts by inflating them away. I think a restructuring is much better than inflating. And I do believe that U.S. bondholders are going to be asked to take a pretty big haircut, whether it's in a restructuring or through inflation. But there's no way. Right? If you own U.S. treasuries and you're a foreigner, I mean, if you're in Russia and you own U.S. treasuries, politicians aren't going to put the interests of a Russian bondholder ahead of an American voter. So our foreign creditors are really low down on the totem pole of getting their money paid back. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we defaulted just on the bonds held by foreigners, but not on those held by Americans. And believe me, if push comes to shove, do you think an American politician is going to say, we need to raise taxes on average Americans, or we need to cut Social Security benefits because we need to pay China the interest on their bonds?
But why not, Mr.
Or
Schiff?
we need to pay China
why
back
not?
to principal because they don't want to roll over that. That will never happen.
But Mr. Schiff, when we are talking about America being addicted to foreign debt, what we are really talking about is the American people being those addicts who, through their lifestyle choices, through their political choices, consumer habits, what have you, it is the American people who are ultimately holding the rest of the world hostage by spending beyond their means. I think you would agree with me that one of the main reasons why the United States transitioned from being the world's greatest creditor to being the world's greatest debtor is because of the low personal savings that Americans used to have.
Yes, but you have to understand why that changed. Why did Americans go from a nation of thrifty savers to a nation of reckless spenders and speculators? It was because of the government. It was because of the Federal Reserve. It was because of the policies we put in place that corrupted our behavior, that distorted our rationale and our way of thinking. So we went from a great creditor, a productive nation, to a nation of debt-based consumers. But it's not because there's something innately wrong with Americans. There's something wrong with our institutions. There's something wrong with our government. Now, yes, we're responsible. We elected those leaders that did this to us. But right now, the world is supporting that by financing it. The world is making it possible for the Fed to print all this money. I mean, our economy is so screwed up because we've been able to issue the world's reserve currency. We've been able to live beyond our means. We're able to consume without producing. We're able to pay for our imports by exporting our inflation.
Mr. Schiff, essentially what you're saying is that everybody shares part of the blame, both the American people with their lifestyle, the American politicians with their policy choices, and the rest of the world for allowing this to happen. But since we already addressed the cause, let me ask you a question about one possible solution, and that is something that you mentioned earlier: inflation or hyperinflation. And this is obviously a very traumatic outcome for any society. But at the end of the day, it is one of those things that if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And many countries, including Russia, underwent hyperinflation, sometimes at the bidding of America's prominent economists. And it was a very painful experience for the country. But at the end of the day, it allows you to put your finances in order. Do you think the American politicians, the American policymakers will have the courage to apply this advice that they so generously give to other countries, to its own people?
Look, I hope so. Hyperinflation is going to be worse than default and restructuring, a legitimate, deflationary collapse. The problem for the United States is if we destroy the dollar's value and, it's no longer going to be the reserve currency, and Americans all of a sudden are in this shock therapy where we have to live within our means. We can only consume to the extent that we produce. Our productive capacity has been so diminished over the years, we don't really know how to survive right now. We don't have the factories. They're gone. We don't have the skilled and trained workforce. Yeah, we have lots of young people with expensive philosophy degrees, but they don't know how to do anything. We'll have to have a real government shutdown so that we can have a startup of free market capitalism. So, we're in a big hole. And so it's not going to be easy to get out of it unless we can go back to our founding principles. It's going to be difficult to ever emerge as a successful, powerful, prominent nation.
Mr. Schiff, I really liked how you compared living within the means to a shock therapy, but we have to take a short break now. When we come back, the tragicomedy of the US default was sparked by strong disagreements over Obama's universal health care reforms. But why don't we ever see that kind of discussion when it comes to America's skyrocketing military spending? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the U.S. addiction to foreign debt with investment broker Peter Schiff. Mr. Schiff, just before we went to a break, we were talking about addiction being a metaphor for what is happening with the U.S. economy. And I would like to introduce yet another comparison, and that one is to the theater of the absurd, which is a genre where actors rarely say what they mean, and the main narrative usually lacks in logic. And if you look at what is happening in the United States, it is a country with very strong credit ratings, double and triple A's, but at the same time, it's also a country that cannot pay its debtors and that cannot pay its own people. Now, we also hear politicians talking about avoiding this major crisis, but in fact, the crisis has only been made worse by adding another $1 trillion to the debt ceiling. It is as if everything has been turned upside down.
Yeah, it is the theater of the absurd. I mean, anybody who puts any stock in those ratings, U.S. Treasuries are junk bonds. It doesn't matter what Standard & Poor's or Moody's says or Fitch. In fact, since the federal government sued Standard & Poor's, I believe, because Standard & Poor's downgraded from AAA to AA+, nobody is ever going to downgrade U.S. Treasuries again. Even if they were in default, I think they would still be up at AAA. But, you have to look beyond that nonsense. I mean, President Obama said that we had to raise the debt ceiling because America always pays its bills. See, that's a lie. We never pay our bills. That's why we have $17 trillion of debt. That's unpaid bills. What the president wanted to do was raise the debt ceiling so we can go on not paying our bills. Because the truth is, we can't afford to pay our bills. That's why we have to borrow more money.
And if we stay with this theater of the absurd metaphor, I think the title for this play was Obamacare. And while I understand that it has very little to do with the actual problem, I think many foreigners are extremely surprised why Americans get so worked up about healthcare, something that I understand is very expensive, but at the same time, something that is crucial for survival. But at the same time, we never get similar debates on, let's say, military spending, which is exorbitant and most Americans would probably be able to do without it. Why are America's priorities so mixed up?
Well, there's no question that we overspend on the national defense. I mean, we're spending money that we don't need to spend. But health care was not always expensive in America. It was very inexpensive until the government got involved with Medicaid and Medicare and all this. The government created this problem. So the reason we had such an inefficient, overpriced healthcare system was because of all the government involvement that screwed up the free market. If the free market was allowed to work in healthcare, healthcare would be plentiful and inexpensive. And instead of recognizing that fact and getting government out of healthcare so that market forces could come back in, we expanded the problems. We got government even more involved, and now healthcare is going to be even more expensive after Obamacare than it was before.
Well, Mr. Schiff, speaking about market forces, I was listening to your webcast the other day, and you were arguing that women in America should pay more for health insurance because they go to the doctors more often, and they happen to be the ones who bring children into this world. And, you know, knowing how much the United States spends on wars overseas, on regime changes in all those various places, what have you, it really comes across as penny wise and pound foolish.
Well, under the rules of Obamacare, insurance companies can't discriminate based on gender. But we know that women of certain age groups, right, are going to use a lot more health care than men. Mainly it's young women. Women in their 20s and 30s are more expensive to insure than men. But when they get older, it might be different. But women, young women in America, they get cheaper car insurance because they're women. If they buy life insurance, they get a cheaper life insurance because they're women. So sometimes being a woman works in your favor, and sometimes it doesn't. But that's because the market is trying to assess risk to have an efficient insurance system. But when the government comes in and mandates that the insurance companies can't price risk accurately, but they have to misprice it, then it makes the whole thing less efficient and everybody ends up paying more.
Absolutely. But what I cannot understand is why would Americans and yourself focus so much on healthcare rather than turning your attention to some other fields where you spend much more. And surely maybe market mechanisms are not given free rein here, but I think this is an issue that could wait a little and you would benefit much more if you would address your attention to something that takes so much of your resources, like, for example, war spending.
Well, healthcare, unfortunately, does take a lot of resources, and the reason we're so preoccupied with it is because it's so screwed up. But how did our healthcare system get so screwed up? Government screwed it up. Government is so involved in that sector. But they've screwed up other sectors. They screwed up education. Look at how expensive our colleges are. Yet look at how little our graduates know. I mean, the government has corrupted everything it's gotten involved in.
Okay, let me phrase my question a bit differently. I know that you are not a big fan of President Obama, and like many, you criticized him for his indecisiveness. And yet a couple of weeks ago, we witnessed him acting extremely swiftly on the issue of Syria. He was ready to bomb that country within days without even waiting for the UN report. And yet, on this particular issue, arguably much more crucial to the well-being of your country, he keeps kicking this can down the road. And I think the United States could save much more if you just avoided a war or two rather than denying some of your citizens universal health care. Don't you think so? There's
no shortage of hypocrisy in Washington, and politicians do things for political reasons. I was very critical of our intentions to get involved in Syria, and I'm glad that the president wasn't able to carry out that threat. But the reason we're able to do this is because we have the reserve currency. If the rest of the world wasn't buying up our bonds, we couldn't afford to maintain this empire. We would have to cut military spending. So it's amazing that you have our big creditors, whether in Russia or China, criticizing what we're doing, but the only reason we can do it is because you're lending us the money. If the world stopped financing our military, we couldn't afford to get so involved in so many places around the world. The only reason we can support and maintain this massive military complex is because we can borrow the money to pay for it. So you can't complain, you're financing it.
Well, that may be a good point. And I wonder, how long do you think politicians, President Obama and the Republicans, I think they are just as complicit here, how long do you think they will keep kicking the can down the road? I mean, is it just a matter of waiting until next elections? Or, I mean, when somebody will do something about that in your view?
They will kick that can down that road until the bondholders bring the road to an end. We will never stop procrastinating, right? You know, if you know a friend who's overweight and they keep telling you that they're going to start their diet next week, you know, why do they want to start it next week? Because they're not going to actually do it. Otherwise, they would just start right now.
Okay,
the government will talk. We will assure everybody that we're going to get our fiscal house in order. We just had the opportunity to do that, and we didn't. In fact, we redefined the problem. As far as we're concerned, the debt's not the problem, it's the ceiling. The problem is that we can't borrow an unlimited amount of money, because that's really what we want to do.
So what essentially you're saying is that the United States will continue acting as an addict, promising that it's going to come clean and never doing it in the long term. Now, I know that you were named Dr. Doom for predicting the 2008 crisis, and it is evident from this interview that your forecasts are not becoming any more optimistic. I wonder if the crisis, this big looming crisis that you've been alluding to in this interview and many others, if this crisis indeed happens, how would it compare to the one that we experienced back in 2008?
Well, for America, it's going to be significantly larger because it's going to involve a crash of the dollar and the U.S. bond market. During the 2008 financial crisis, the dollar and the U.S. bond market gained value, so that was a giant cushion for American citizens. It enabled the bailouts and all the government stimulus. But when the crisis is in our currency, in our bond market, we don't have that. So for America, it's going to be significantly worse. For the rest of the world, it depends on how they react. If the world feels they have to try to prop us up and lend us even more money in the crisis, then our pain will be exported. But I think that to the extent that the world wakes up and learns from the mistakes of the past, doesn't repeat what they did wrong in 2008, it could be very liberating for the rest of the world. It could be a huge benefit for our creditors. And so my hope as an American citizen is that we then do the right thing. We get the right message. We get our act together. We readopt the principles of sound money and limited government. We start shutting down a lot of government for real. Not a phony government shutdown, but legitimately starts shutting down all those institutions that have undermined our economic freedoms and our productivity for years.
And if, or rather when that happens, what is your contingency plan? Where do you keep your money?
You know, I've got my money invested abroad. I've got a lot of gold and silver, commodities. I do have some U.S. investments. I own a lot of oil here in the United States. But, you know, I haven't left. I mean, I still live here. I still live in America. So I'm hoping for the best. I hope it doesn't get so bad that people have to leave. I know there are people who are leaving. They're afraid of what might happen in this economic catastrophe, in a hyperinflationary environment, what type of civil unrest there might be. So there are people that are leaving.
You're saying that you still have some hope and that you're keeping some of your money in the American instruments. But I wonder if you indeed believe that this giant Ponzi scheme to which you alluded earlier collapses, why do you think there would be some safe havens? Because the world is very interconnected these days, and if something happens in the United States, with the degree to which the rest of the world is invested in the United States, why do you think those assets that you're investing in will still be safe?
Well, remember, if I'm looking for a dollar collapse where the dollar really loses its role as a reserve currency or is significantly marked down in value, that's a very different situation, because if I own the currencies or assets outside the U.S., they're going to automatically rise in value. But what you have to understand is right now, America is a net drain on the global economy because we consume more than we produce. We're borrowing more than we save. which means the rest of the world has to suffer because they have to support this. They have to subsidize this. And so when the dollar goes down and Americans lose their purchasing power advantage relative to everybody else, the world is now going to be awash in resources, awash in consumer goods that were previously being used by Americans are now going to be freed up and enjoyed by other people. So it's not terrible for the people who have been bearing the burden to have that burden removed. I mean, everybody has it backwards. They think we do the world a favor by consuming everything and borrowing everything, but it's the other way around.
Okay, Mr. Schiff, I hope our viewers take your advice. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for. Thank you very much for being here. And if you like the program, please join us again. Same place, same time here on Worlds Apart.